Russia has said repeatedly that they're willing to have a dialogue, but the dialogue has to be based on existing realities on the ground. The Swiss foreign minister came to India, and the Ukrainian foreign minister came to India, and they want India very much to participate in this. They feel that if India did, then countries of the global south would follow.
Painting out Putin as the only demon in this story may not entirely be correct.
Well, let me put it this way: the narrative on this is totally controlled by the West. The demonization of Putin will continue. They paint him as a person who's Hitler-like, evil, tends to recreate the Soviet Empire, which is complete nonsense.
Russia invaded Ukraine. At that time, it was called the first major war in Europe after the Second World War. But at that time, it was anticipated that Kiev would fall in a matter of weeks, if not days. However, that didn't happen. 2 years, 2 months later, the war continues to drag on. With the help of its Western allies, Kiev is holding fort, although it's losing rapidly on the field. The big question that I want to start with is anybody talking about a peace? Because there have been lots of peace conversations. This war is just going on and on.
As you know, Zelensky has passed a decree which stipulates that there can be no peace negotiations with Russia until President Putin is in power. And now, as you know, President Putin has won another term of 6 years, which means that unless this decree is rescinded, Ukraine cannot enter into any peace negotiations with Russia. Now, as you know, there is a Swiss-led peace initiative based on Zelensky's 10-point peace plan. But before that,
Russia is not invited to that. So,
yeah, but before that,
negotiate with.
Let me say something else. The Chinese got into the game, and they proposed a peace plan, a 12-point peace plan. And Russia has said, Foreign Minister Lavrov said a few days ago, that the basis of the Chinese peace plan is much more acceptable than the one which Zelensky is proposing. As you have rightly said, that the peace summit based on Zelensky's 10-point peace plan will not include Russia in the initial phase, as they say. Later on, after they have amongst themselves, without Russia's participation, decided on the way forward, then they can invite Russia to come in. In other words, Russia would be presented with a broad framework of a plan to move forward in which they've had no role.
Right. And why would Putin agree to that anyway?
They rejected it. In fact, Foreign Minister Lavrov said a couple of days ago that this is a very cunning diplomatic effort on the part of NATO and Switzerland. And in fact, he roundly said that Switzerland has lost all credibility because they have imposed all the sanctions that the West has imposed on Russia, and that they are no longer neutral. But as you know, the Swiss foreign minister came to India, and the Ukrainian foreign minister came to India, and they want India very much to participate in this. They feel that if India did, then countries of the global south would follow, and this would make the entire conference more credible. And in fact, the Ukrainian foreign minister said that, you can, in these 10 points, you can choose which points you are in agreement with, and that can be the basis of your participation. In other words, they're trying all kinds of methods to persuade India to participate. Now, the fact is, India has participated in the previous 3 or 4 rounds of behind-the-scene negotiations or discussions in Copenhagen, in Saudi Arabia, and Malta. But these meetings did not issue any statements whatever, and nothing has appeared in the press as to what was the broad basis on which the participants felt that the negotiations could move forward. Now, the short point is that I personally cannot see how the Swiss conference can lead to anything constructive. Because if one of the two principal parties involved in the conflict is not present,
Right.
then you cannot have a successful meeting. And Russia is not going to be faced with a fait accompli saying that, look, this is the framework which we feel that is adequate and it has the support of the global South, and therefore you should respond to it. This is, in fact, this is putting Russia on the mat.
Right.
Now, the other thing is that the 10-point peace plan, which Russia simply can't accept apart from the territorial issues, is that there should be reparations by Russia, as also war crime trial of those Russians who've committed such crimes. Now, look, you can impose these kind of conditions when the other country has surrendered, like Japan did and Germany did. So you can't impose such conditions on Russia. You declared, in fact, President Putin a war criminal. So I really don't know how the West is approaching the entire problem. And the latest is the sanctioning, the passing of $61 billion of aid, in the U.S. Congress for Ukraine. It's a $97 billion thing, but there is money in it for Israel as well as for something else.
For that.
For Taiwan, I think.
Yes.
So now, let me make another point. That if the intention is to genuinely hold a dialogue and a peace conference, then it should be preceded by some gesture on the part of the West, which would signal that they are serious. So some stepping back. One could easily be that the decree that Ukraine passed should be rescinded so that there is no legal bar on Ukraine entering into negotiations with Russia face to face without us present. Or it could be that you didn't pass the kind of legislation that the US Congress passed, because the whole idea is to give them longer range weapons so they can attack the Crimean Bridge and also strike deep into Russian territory.
Right.
And now, as you know, the NATO Secretary General has announced just a couple of days ago that there are NATO military advisors on the ground in Ukraine, which are in a non-combat role. So they would advise and they would also help in filling the gap which will be created with the Ukrainians are going to the front and fighting. In other words, they're directly involved and they are admitting that they are. And this is just before the so-called peace conference in Switzerland.
Right. So tell me, sir, this warmongering, in the Western nations, in the NATO US-led West, Russia is painted out to be this demon which is there, and arguably, the invasion of Ukraine. Both sides have their own versions of why Russia invaded Ukraine or why they shouldn't have invaded Ukraine. But having said that, during the course of the last 2 years, 2 months, there have been several peace pits, as you've just pointed out. It seems Russia, and they've very candidly said that we are happy to negotiate, but it's the Western intervention via which those are the reports that we heard. The last minute peace deal was sort of scuttled. How do you explain this very warmongering nature then from the West? Do you believe that's what one should believe in?
I think partly you answered the question in your opening comments, saying that there was the expectation that Russia would have a walkover. Russia didn't have a walkover for whatever reason. And this view gained ground in the West that Russia has made a serious mistake, and the West will make them pay a price for it, bleed them, militarily weaken them, impose a strategic defeat on them. And in fact, just like the Russians got caught in Afghanistan and the Americans got caught in Vietnam, that this is an opportunity to bleed Russia.
Hmm.
The other thing is what Johnson said a few days ago. You must have heard this, that they cannot allow Russia to succeed because that will be the end of Western hegemony.
Hmm.
And now the narrative has got developed, and which is being repeated at various levels by very senior people in the Western political and military establishments, that if Russia wins, then they'll attack the Baltic states and Poland, and therefore European security is at stake. I am a bit surprised, honestly, because I have high regard for French diplomacy, but French President Macron himself said that we have to send an ambiguous strategic signal to Russia, and European troops could be positioned on Ukrainian soil. And going on to say, not Macron himself, but from the European side, that they will protect Odessa, and they'll send in their forces, non-combat forces into Odessa, or position them on the west bank of the Dnieper River, so as to prevent the Russians from crossing that and capturing more territory in Ukraine. So clearly, they do not fear that the whole conflict could escalate to the point where there is a grave danger of the use of nuclear weapons. Now, I know this from my personal conversations with some people at policy-making level in the West, that they believe that Russia will not do this, that they have tested Russia's reactions and responses. Earlier on, they said, oh, if you send these tanks, then Russia will react. Or before that, if you send long-range artillery, Russia will react. If you send Patriot uh, ballistic missile defense units, Russia will react. Then F-16s, Russia will react. And Russia has not reacted. Therefore, they're playing with fire. They can't,
Yeah,
they can't, they can't judge at
because
what point
you
Russia
can't
will.
compete with Mr. Putin.
They can't judge at what point Russia will lose patience and feel that unless they send a very strong deterrent signal, this kind of escalation will go on and put Russia increasingly in a difficult position. Now, if you recognize that Russia, along with the United States, is the world's foremost nuclear power, and what are nuclear weapons meant for? They're meant for use in very critical situations. So if you help develop that critical situation, you are running the risk of use of nuclear weapons. Now, there is a whole world outside Europe and NATO. Their future is at stake. And why should we tolerate this kind of warmongering that is going on in Europe?
But what about warmongering in Europe? Do you believe that India can play a role? Because, as you pointed out yourself, that the West is falling over itself to somehow get India at that peace summit. Um, Russia perhaps also wants India at that peace summit, if it wants that peace summit. If I don't think they view it as a peace summit at all. Um, what role do you see India playing there, if at all India decides to attend? Will they?
No, not a marginal role. Because if really the United States wants to talk to Russia, they can do so. During the Cold War, they talked to the Soviet Union all the time.
Right.
And during the phase of progressive expansion of NATO, they were talking to Russia all the time, despite the fact that Russia was protesting very strongly about the expansion of NATO. They were talking until recently on, after all, Biden and Putin, they met in Geneva in June 2021, I think, if I'm mistaken not. And it's a hopeful sign that they'll be able to contain the conflict in Ukraine. The CIA director was ambassador to Russia. In fact, he was there in Russia when I was ambassador there, and I got to know him a little bit. a very sober man, and he has credibility. In fact, Putin, in his interview with Tucker Carlson, had words of praise for Burns, William Burns. Uh, he has talked actually to his counterpart in Russia. This has come out. So if they really want to reach out to the Russians and establish some kind of an understanding on controlling the escalation and moving towards some form of dialogue, they can do it. They don't need India's help. That is one aspect. The other is that when President Biden currently wants to pump in more money and more arms into Ukraine, signaling that there is no change in the overall direction of their policy towards Russia. And Europe is becoming even more hostile and willing to actually pump in more arms and money into Ukraine. Then if the two protagonists on the Western side, that is Europe and the United States, have a certain strategy, then what can India do? How will we persuade the Americans or the Europeans or NATO that they must find a way out? I mean, what is it that we have in our hands which can persuade them to do so? And if you go to Russia, Russia will say, well, we have said repeatedly we're willing to talk. But the talk has to be on a realistic basis, and we must carry forward from where we ended in Istanbul, which Ukraine is totally unwilling to accept. So how then what do we tell Russia? You must give up, if not Crimea, but give up some of the territory you have annexed. I mean, how can we persuade Russia to do that? And when we go and knock on Zelensky's door, and he says no question, and we say, look, why don't you at least revise this, rescind this decree that you have passed? You think he can do it? He needs the support of his entire establishment to do that, and it will be a very serious walk back from the position they have taken. In fact, he's going around and clamoring and knocking at every door. Please give me more arms. Please give me more arms. Because you've exposed me, you made me vulnerable. I could have prevented all these attacks that Russia is making on my power grid and everything else if you had given me more aerial defense stuff. And now,
or just to make peace when I wanted to.
And then the latest is that which country has transferred one of his? Finland of all countries. They have transferred one Patriot missile unit to a newly minted member of NATO. It has contributed a patriotic unit to Ukraine, and the Polish president has said openly that he would welcome the positioning of U.S. nuclear arms in Poland. Now, this kind of a background, what can India do?
So in this scenario, Answer, in your experience, painting out Putin now that the conflict is into its third year, painting out Putin as the only demon in this story may not entirely be correct.
Well, let me put it this way. The narrative on this is totally controlled by the West. Russia is not able to control this narrative because if the New York Times, Washington Post, The Economist, and FT, and Le Monde, and all their television channels purvey a certain line, the world takes notice of it. Now, Russian media has been banned in the West, so the Russian story doesn't get across. Russia, maybe RT is heard in India and in African countries and elsewhere, but they don't shape the global narrative. So the demonization of Putin will continue. They paint him as a person who's Hitler-like, who's very evil, and he intends to recreate the Soviet Empire, which is complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. There's not a single statement that Putin has made that he wants to recreate the Soviet Empire. But they say it, and this is repeated by the Western media time and again. And they have these scenarios where he's going to walk into this country, into that country, after he has dominated Ukraine. Now, there is a huge contradiction in the narrative. On the one hand, they say, as was said very recently by an American, I forget at very high level, that we have destroyed 90% of Russia's. I think Blinken, 90% of Russia's military machine as existed before the Ukraine war. Russia has been weakened, and then in the same breath they say Russia is going to attack NATO. And then in the same breath they say Russia is going to attack NATO. Make up your mind. If Russia has already been defeated, strategically defeated, which Americans keep saying all the time, and the Europeans, then if they strategically defeated, then what is the danger of, and what is the capacity of Russia attacking Europe? But nobody bothers about these contradictions because who's going to challenge this?
True. My last question to you, sir, and it's about November. If, and I'm putting a huge if there, if Trump walks into the Oval Office and the White House, how are things going to change as far as the Ukraine-Russia conflict is concerned, if at all?
Well, first of all, Trump is very unpredictable. Number two, if you recall that he was boasting that he was the man who had imposed the largest number of sanctions on Russia.
Yeah.
He was trying to convey the message that the belief that he's soft on Putin or soft on Russia is wrong, that he actually punished Russia during his tenure. And now, as the latest is that he has made the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives totally change his position. Where earlier, if you read his statements, very clear, no question of spending more taxpayers' money on Ukraine. And there's no accountability of where the money is going. There is this, there is that. The latest was, no, Ukraine has to be supported. Ukraine must be supported. And he got the green light from Trump, as is reported widely. So you can't really say how Trump will react if he's elected, whether he will really look for a way to settle things with Russia, whether he'll be willing to talk to Putin. He could surprise all of us by taking some unpredictable step. But the point is, they got so far down this road in creating this threat from Russia that stepping back would imply a loss of credibility and loss of prestige. And Europe, which has actually exposed itself terribly, and under pressure from the Americans, and with a view to Trump coming back to power, and Trump's demands that I'm going to wrap up NATO, you must do more burden sharing, you must increase your defense spending to 2%, which the Europeans, including Germany, have fallen into line. Now, having also participated in this demonizing of Putin and Russia, and looking for some kind of a military solution as the basis of a negotiated solution later on, Europe would be totally exposed if Trump made this kind of a peaceful gesture towards Russia, and the European public would be very surprised. And one thing I'd like to add is Germany. What really surprises me is how Germany has lost all sense of guilt about what Nazi Germany did to Russia. And they are sending in arms, German arms, to Ukraine to kill more Russians. I thought that they would have a sense of history. And from the look, we are an external player, so we can't really fully understand the psychology and the dynamics of what is happening. Well, one would have thought that Germany, as the most powerful country in Europe and the economic pillar of Europe, would have realized that there can never be a stable European security order unless Germany and Russia have some kind of a modus vivendi, some kind of a basis of friendship.
That seems like a far cry today, sir, given that Germany is the second largest, exporter of arms.
Yes, indeed, and they have voluntarily accepted the destruction of their Nord Stream pipeline, which is costing them immensely, and the economy is going into recession.
Wow, we can have this conversation and go on, but I would love to have you again, sir. A more in depth, detailed conversation on the role of these individual countries. And I hope our viewers would enjoy that and would sort of gain some perspective on why is the world reacting to Russia the way it is? Why do they feel that Russia is going to not just Ukraine, after Ukraine, is going to go to Poland, to the Baltic nations, maybe all the way up to France, the way Macron is behaving. So, those are some perspectives that we'd love to have from you going forward. But thank you so much for your time right now.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you, viewers, for watching this broadcast. We will come back to you with more. Stay tuned to Times of India.